privilege to welcome you all to kickstart this 4-day 2021 Economic Symposium on towards net zero. Very topical, given that we just come out of COP26 and also climate change is one of the most pressing events that we're facing, the disaster. So without wasting more time, let me introduce our two speakers for the day who are going to be answering all your questions. And before that, I am Sanchayan. I am an Eden Fellow and finally a PhD in Environmental Economics at the Department of Geography and Environment. My research looks at behavioral and experimental economics at steering people's pro-environmental behaviors. Particularly, I work towards reducing meat consumption using nudges and more reflective interventions. We have here today with us Laurie. Laurie Parsons is a lecturer in human geography at Royal Holloway, University of London. He is the principal investigator of the project Disaster Trade, the hidden footprint of UK imports and investment overseas. His work explores how climate change is articulated through the social, political, and economic systems within which we live. Secretary of the RGS's Climate Change Research Group for the last 3 years, he's worked extensively to promote cross-disciplinary research on climate change in the social sciences. His first book, Going Nowhere Fast, Inequality in the Age of Translocality, was published by Oxford University Press in August 2020, and subsequently it was shortlisted for the EuroSeas 2021 Social Sciences Book Prize. An edited collection entitled Climate Change and Global Workplace was published with Routledge in 2021 and explores how climate change is reshaping the nature of work in the 21st century. Welcome, Laurie. Thank you so much for joining us. Next up, we also have Richard. Dr. Richard S.J. Toll is a professor at the Department of Economics, University of Sussex, the Professor of Economics of Climate Change, Institute of Environmental Studies, and Department of Spatial Economics, Vrije University, Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and also a research fellow of the Tinbergen Institute, CSIFO, and the Payne Institute for Public Policy. He's an elected member of the European Academy. Formerly, he was a research professor at the Economics and Social Research Institute, Dublin, the Michael Otto Professor of Sustainability and Global Change at Hamburg University, and an adjunct professor, Department of Engineering and Public Policy, Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, USA. He's had visiting appointments at the Canadian Centre for Climate Research, University of Victoria in British Columbia, at the Center of Social and Economic Research on Global Environment in UCL, and the Princeton Environmental Institute and Department of Economics in Princeton University. He's received an MSc in econometrics and a PhD in economics at Vrije University, Amsterdam. He's ranked amongst the top 100 economists in the world and among the top 100 most cited climate scholars. He has over 290 publications in learned journals. He specializes in the economics of energy, environment, and climate, and is interested in integrated assessment modeling, which I'm sure there's a question for him today, if you guys are interested. He's the editor-in-chief of Energy Economics, a top field journal. He's also the author of the only textbook on the economics of climate change. He's an advisor and referee of national and international policy and research. He was also an author of the working groups 1, 2, and 3 of the IPCC, which shared the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize for 2007. It's really a great pleasure introducing both of you. Let me get started with questions. So I have 2 questions, which are broad questions for both of you. So we'll just alternate between you two. And then I have some specific questions before I have, again, a common question for you both. So the first question, and maybe we can start with Richard, going over to Laurie after that. So COP26 has ended with agreement, but fallen short of climate action. Do you think there has been meaningful progress? And do you think this progress is fast enough to reach our climate targets, Richard?
A lot of things have happened. A lot of things always happen at these conferences of the parties. The thing that struck me as a success, well, 2 things struck me as a success. First, that the redshift mechanism that was agreed in Paris is actually working. That most countries, not all, but most countries have promised to do more than they did in the past. So that is working. The other thing that struck me about the negotiations in Glasgow or Edinburgh, people were a bit unsure where it was. is that the pretense that everybody's moving at the same speed is gradually being abandoned. We see more and more coalitions of the willing around methane, for instance, or coal in South Africa, where we do not wait for all the other 192 countries, but we go with a smaller group of countries, we move forward. So those two developments, I think, are positive. What I found disappointing is that there's a plane coming over very, very low, sorry. But what I found disappointing is that the pretense that we can meet the 2 degrees target is still there. That nobody dared to stand up and say, we're never going to get there, let's stop pretending. And the reason that I find that disappointing is because I'm worried about the backlash. And there's two concerns with the backlash. One is we promised something that in Paris, and actually 10 years before Paris, we knew we would never get to. So why promise it? It just demotivates people to come up with a target that you can never achieve. But because this has been set as a target, and because so many people are now invested in this target, the other thing that is most likely to happen, probably during this decade, but if not during the next decade, is that we will hit that 1.5 degrees target. The global mean surface air temperature will be 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial times. And then people have predicted that the world will end, and it won't, right? There's nothing in the literature to suggest that the world will end at 1.5 or 2 degrees, or that anything very significant would happen at those thresholds. And that, of course, that sets into motion this negative backlash that you guys promised the catastrophe. If we didn't do this, the catastrophe isn't there. So why should I ever believe a word that you're saying ever again? And that I found disappointing, that no politician was willing to stand up and say, sorry, guys, we lied to you in Paris. It's time to move on and set a more realistic target.
No, thank you. I think that also feeds into one of my questions that I'll save for later about the targets and the feasibility. But Laurie, your thoughts?
Yes, well, well, I was lucky enough to be at COP26, as I was just discussing with Richard before we began this yet. So I was there for the first 3 days in Glasgow, and that was well, one in which I could certainly get the full impression of the lack of civil society, certainly in those early days. That was the Leaders Summit, during which you have everything very closed off. There's very little access to any of these negotiations as they're going on. Nevertheless, it was possible to certainly get a sense of the proceedings. And one of the things that really came across, I really did feel, was the diversity of different perspectives which were in that room. Of course, you have academics, you have social scientists, you have people who work to a predominant sense on adaptation. You also have a very large amount, certainly at this COP, of industry interests and of national interests. Now, depending on which of these you talk to, you get a completely different perspective. I mean, the account of that COP that just happened will be almost chalk and cheese. And really, if you think about it on a national scale, or an international scale rather, you know, whether you're coming from Australia or the UK or Bangladesh, is going to have a huge influence on what you think happened, essentially. I mean, I think the broad reading is that many industrial actors were fairly satisfied, that there was a sense within the overall high-level negotiation that this was something that at least kept the train on track. But it was something which very much upset people more concerned with the adaptation side of the equation, certainly people who were representing countries in the global south, and in particular those who are most heavily impacted by climate change, such as Bangladesh, which has a rightly significant presence in that arena because it is simply so vulnerable, and has rightly devoted a lot of energy to discussing these issues which are so important about ongoing impacts and ongoing needs for adaptation. So each of those voices has essentially promoted a different viewpoint on what came out of this. My own feeling, of course, I mean, is that, of course, it was nowhere near enough in terms of achieving anything like it was saying. One of the things that I did feel coming away from it, however, was I was somewhat surprised that there was almost a willingness to declare that this was not a failure. And I do think that's something that comes out of the history of previous COPs, and in particular in relation to Copenhagen, in 2009. This was, of course, that was one of the key factors which was seen as promulgating a huge dip in public interest and public seriousness about climate change, which really lasted a decade, and it took a lot of work to come back from that. So I do feel that that's something that has been an intentional effort made by scholars and journalists and people working in this area to avoid that feeling of hopelessness that you can build up to something so big and ultimately see it purely as a failure. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that this relates to a lot of the points that Richard made, and in particular the way that COP's been presented in this slightly nebulous way, as if it's, you know, it's broadly a success, but it's difficult to say exactly to what extent and in what ways. So, yes, I think that the marketing of this conference is in many ways almost an actor in what will happen going forward. And it's important to bear that in mind, perhaps. But yes, not nearly enough, of course, on a practical level.
No, I think I hear you, and both Richard, but you made a good point there about perspectives and sort of different voices, but you also kept this open-ended bit, which leads me to my next question, a nice segue. So perhaps let's start with you. So what do you think that the next few decades are going to look for in terms of climate action? How do you see different actors coming along, and what are our responsibilities, the government, the citizens, our researchers? What would you expect us to do differently, perhaps, if one would say?
Well, okay, so it's a little bit, to some extent, difficult to separate this question out from what I think will happen and what I would like to happen. I mean, perhaps I should begin with what I would like to happen, which is certainly that I think that we, of course, need to perhaps mainstream the study of climate change into all kinds of arenas of the economy and of business and civil society in a way which currently is happening, but needs to be perhaps a little bit more organic and bottom up. One of the things that frustrates me most, I think, is the lack of engagement between global policy and perhaps the realities on the ground. It's important to always have an eye on the ground and perhaps listen to these local perspectives, because that gives it helps to resolve some of the silos that we tend naturally to see evolving in the climate change arena, because of course people have their disciplines, they have their interests, and this ends up creating different framings of understanding issues, which perhaps creates, or at least elides, some of the really important areas. What I personally would like to see is a greater recognition of the role of the global economy in shaping the impact of climate change. And I see this as a positive in a number of respects. Firstly, because I think it's necessary to get a better handle on the specific impact of the global economy, not just in terms of emissions, but also in terms of the way in which global economic processes in place actually intensify the impacts of those emissions. The way in which, for example, we see that very large-scale factory areas have an impact on driving farmers off land, on increasing precarity, potentially also the ways in which local economic changes reduce or impede farmers and smallholder farmers' ability to cope with the environmental factors that they face, and in particular also recognizing the ways in which these economic processes and these climatic processes are not just centered on the individual households and families and transnational, translocal networks. They're still very important in coping here, and there's a lot that can be learned, I think, from the social sciences in particular, in bringing in some of these very nuanced and local perspectives on how these kind of things play out. In terms of what will happen, generally I'm far more pessimistic than I would like to be, because there seems to be, to me, such a powerfully embedded set of interests which mainstream and essentially make this almost an obelisk around which we can't move, which is we need to protect. I mean, I'm sure Richard will have very strong views on this, far better informed than me, but certainly in this area of not being able to have significant cuts in the profitability and the kind of size of the energy sector. It seems like such huge environmental impacts and progress could be made if we were willing to accept economic losses on that side. However, again, this is an area I think Richard would be far better placed than me to follow.
Richard, do you want to come in and justify the far better place?
Maybe. I think three significant things will happen over the next 10 or 15 years. In late June, there was a piece in the Telegraph about a heat wave in Jacobobot. And there's been a widely accepted prediction that at 55 degrees dry heat, the human body will start coming apart and we will all die. And during this heat wave, the temperature was above this threshold, and the journalists wandered around town wondering why these people were not all dead. And I think that over the next 10 or 15 years, we will see a lot of this sort of journalism, that a lot of the predictions of catastrophe will not come true. The second thing, in very similar vein, over the next 10 or 15 years, politicians, or more likely their successors of current politicians, will have to reckon with the fact that their promises of very major job creation through climate policy will not come through, that their promises of very substantial emission reduction at minimal cost will not come through. And the political dialogue around climate policy will have to completely change when finally confronted with the facts. And then the third thing that will happen over the next 10 or 15 years is the same thing as has happened over the last 30 years or so. That industry will slowly chip away at the problem. What we've seen is that particularly the costs of solar and wind power have fallen very, very substantially, much faster than anybody could have predicted. From your introduction, people may have guessed that I've been in this game for 30 years or so, and it definitely surprised almost everybody, the speed at which this happened. And we will see similar things continue to happen. I think the next one to go, and that is what you are interested in, Sanchayan, is the emergence of alternative proteins, where over the last 5 years or so, progress has been extremely rapid and definitely taking some people by surprise. And that is, of course, what we need to cut emissions in the long run very substantially. We would simply make the alternatives, the low carbon, low methane, low nitrous alternatives, more attractive for people to use.
No, that's a great point, and I do acknowledge that these backstops have to kick in, and then the substitute has to sort of become cheaper. And maybe there is a possibility of sort of the top down and bottom up converging at some point in terms of governance to deliver that. But beautiful points. I think two questions to follow on. You mentioned at the beginning, and so we go to Laurie now, and I really liked it. So a recent study in Science Advances actually points that by 2100, some parts of the world like India and Eastern China might be so bad in terms of how people live that even the fittest might find it hard to survive, which then brings in the question of climate migration and how sort of people might have to move around between places and getting displaced. How do you feel this scenario is going to play out? And what are some of the ethical distributional consequences of of a possibility of this happening, Laurie?
Yes, so this is a very big and a very important question, which I think it's important to address. Yes, so this idea of these huge climate migrations which are predicted to occur in the coming years, I think this is particularly important, not just for the scientific accuracy of these numbers, but also because of the political importance of those numbers and what they do to discourse and the debate more broadly. So there's been a number in recent years of very large-scale predictions about large-scale global climate migrations, which have centered in particular on large-scale quantitative estimates. We've seen some of them which have been empirical estimates of previous years. We've also seen many forecasts of future years. So, for example, we had the World Bank's estimate that something like 25 million people were displaced in 2016, for example, based on empirical estimates. We've had the very famous Myers estimate that 200 million people would be displaced by 2050. And then, of course, we had Geisler and Kearns back in 2017 making, I think, the largest prediction yet, which was that 2 billion people would be mobile as a result of climate change in 2100. Now, the important thing to recognize about all of these estimates is that they rely to a certain extent on quite similar methodologies, and these are cross-sectional, often called Ricardian analyses based on existing data sets. And there's been a whole kind of story of analysis around the issue of climate migration, predominantly because it's been so powerful as in the way in which it has captured public and political attention. So there has been a great drive in scholarship to be able to get a good hang on these numbers and to understand a very reliable estimate on what we expect to see in terms of mobility in the coming years. And this has naturally involved a large amount of scaling up. There's been several efforts to estimate sea level rise against mobility, for example, and increasingly these continental scale mobility estimates, for example, looking at rainfall as measured by verdancy indexes, for example, on the African continent, and then trying to then putting together all kinds of different levels of data sets in order to understand the overall impact on mobility. But the problem is, with however high you scale it up, essentially these estimates don't tend to correlate very well with what you actually see on the ground. So to a certain extent, in the more recent years, we're talking the last 5 years or so, there's been a reversal in that process, away from continental and global scale estimates towards looking at these things on a very small scale and understanding how they actually impact locally, to try to get a better sense of the direct connections between climatic and local migratory patterns. But the problem is, once you go this small, you essentially get to a situation where things start to look a little bit complicated. At this point, extremely difficult to separate out the impact of the climate from the impact of, for example, labour, and that this is something that is increasingly being recognised. So this is an area in which I've done a significant amount of work to try to understand all of these different diversities in the way that the climate impacts people. And what you find is, if you look at a very small scale, for example, the perceptions of the climate, to understand what people actually say about how they've experienced the climate in recent years, that they say something like, if you look at it on a map, you can plot these things and you see that people, neighbours, say opposite things. You know, have you experienced the drought in the last year? You know, one person in one house will say yes, the other person next door will say no. And this, of course, doesn't make sense if you're just looking at geography, climate, and mobility outcome. But what it does point to is that the role of all kinds of factors, from the cultural to the social to the economic, play a huge intermediary role in shaping perceptions of the climate. And this is something which I think is extremely important in this debate, and it also relates to the framing of the question itself, which is the issue of heat. So if we're talking about, you know, are people going to be dying of heat stress in the coming years? Well, yeah, the answer is yes, and they're dying now, but which people? It isn't going to be just an entirely bounded national region wherein the entire population is dying of this heat stress. It'll be the people who are most exposed, people in certain jobs, people who have certain limited capacity to adapt to it, or perhaps have the technology, perhaps, whether it's even something like a fan, to avoid it. So understanding those intermediary processes, and I think, yeah, moving away from that direct relationship between climate and migration is very important, if only, and I'll finish in a second, if only for the way in which it will perhaps help us to move away from the rather securitized view on climate migration that we've traditionally come to expect, which has seen a very large amount of finance on climate mobility centered on areas that we see as being problematic from a political migration point of view, and perhaps less about the specific climatic impacts that we'd expect to see.
No, thank you. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the vulnerabilities out there, and the more vulnerable ones, there is definitely a political and ethical question there. But all of this actually hinges on the numbers that researchers like Richard and other people doing IAMs put out there. So my next question is for Richard, that how well do we actually know about how much climate change will affect us? Is it one sector? Is it multi-sectoral? And can we calculate these costs through integrated assessment modeling, which I was reading out from your intro? And then known knowns and unknown unknowns, as one word to say. How sure are we of these unknown unknowns and of the uncertainties around climate change?
That's a very large question. The final question, or the intermediate question, is actually simple. Can this be calculated? Yes. Ralph Dart's estimated was the first one to estimate the impacts of global climate change in 1979. So yes, it can obviously be done. It has been done, right? The question is not, can it be done? The question is, how good and how complete are these estimates? And to start with the latter, how complete are these estimates? The answer is they're incomplete. But as I also said, we've been working at it for 40 years, more than 40 years now. Whenever somebody has put up a new estimate, somebody else has complained and said, but you forgot this or that. And I would say that over the last 4 decades, we have sort of got the most important ones. I think it would be very hard to argue that after so much time we have forgotten the big one, right? So I would say that yes, you can think of 100 things that have not been included in these estimates, but I would argue that these are probably 100 small things, not 100 big things. Of course, I may be wrong, right? We haven't estimated it yet, so we don't know whether my assessment of priority is correct. The question, how accurate are these, or what is the quality of these estimates, is the more important one. And I think that Laurie gave the right answer there. And that is that these impacts don't happen in a vacuum. It's not, I mean, climate determinism just isn't real. Geographical determinism, environmental determinism just isn't real. These things are mediated through societies, through technologies, through economies, and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of human agency in this as well. Humans will try to take advantage of the new opportunities of climate change that climate change brings, and will try to minimize the negative impacts, right? Definitely for themselves. So there's a lot of things that are going on here, and all of these things will be different in the future. Laurie mentioned Bangladesh as a country that is particularly vulnerable to climate change. As people may have guessed, I am from the Netherlands. The Netherlands is very similar to Bangladesh. It is on the coast, on a big river, floods from the river, floods from the sea, the occasional big storm coming in, very low lying, very densely populated, and yet we do not worry about what sea level rise would do to the Netherlands. And that is, we do not need to worry about what sea level rise would do to the Netherlands after 1850. When the Netherlands started its modern dike building program, which followed directly from political reforms in the country that sort of did away with the merchants that were ruling the country, the oligarchs that were ruling the country in their own self-interest, and replaced them with democratic, more or less democratic, not if you're a woman, not if you're a Catholic, but more or less democratic government that worked for the best of the country. And 10 years ago, Bangladesh would be a poster child of vulnerability to sea level rise. But what we have seen over the last decade or so is that politics in Bangladesh has stabilized, that sort of the going back and forth between two parties that were basically not running the country, but just stealing from each other. That was the main priority. That has basically gone away. Now we have a pretty nasty, but a pretty stable government. And we've seen very rapid economic growth in Bangladesh. And if they continue on this path, then they will have the economic wherewithal, and they already have the technical skills to actually cope with sea level rise. So everything is contingent on other things that are going on. And that makes forecasting the impacts of climate change extremely difficult and extremely contingent. And anybody who would go out there and say the number is 2.3 or 5.7, that's just pure bluff, or they're fools, one of the two. What you can do is elucidate the mechanisms. Perhaps we have a rough handle on the order of magnitude, but anything more precise than that, I don't think we can do.
No, that's great. And then since we are on numbers, it's good to sort of pitch in this question. So do you think the 1.5 is the right target? You revisited this in one of your answers before, saying people might reach it and then say catastrophe hasn't happened, doomsday hasn't come. How much should we update those numbers as we go along?
Well, what we should understand is that the 2 degrees target that was initially set, I believe in Lima, is based on nothing. It comes from a very old advisory report to the German government without much evidence, and you can show that that report actually has major methodological and conceptual flaws, right? So the 2 degrees target is based on nothing. The 1.5 target, I believe, was introduced to keep the 2.5 on the table as a sort of a negotiating tactic, rather than that there was ever any justification for it. These targets are not feasible. It's simply too late to get there. The reason is that, I mean, the climate system is very conservative. We simply have built up a lot of additional warming in the system, but the energy system is also very conservative. Power plants have a lifetime of 40 to 60, sometimes 80 years. And there's various countries around the world where coal-fired power plants are still being planned and commissioned. And they will go out of commission around 2080, 2090. So that is sort of the earliest point where we can reach net, or where we can reach gross zero emissions without premature retirement of capital. And the problem with capital destruction, which is a better expression here, is that it's very expensive. And you can sort of imagine that the Chinese government could do this to its companies, but you can simply not imagine that a democratically elected government, as in India, would ever do this to the Indian economy. It's simply unimaginable that they would do this. So gross emissions will not go to zero until very late in this century. So then the only way to get to 1.5, 2 degrees targets is by having very substantial direct air capture, very substantial negative carbon energy. The problem with that is that that is technically it may be feasible, economically it may be doable. Politically, I just don't see this happen. Going back to what integrated assessment models can do for you, they can actually do these what-if scenarios. And if you take these integrated assessment models and look at what do they assume about sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, at what price, we're talking about subsidies in the order of magnitude of, depending on the model, somewhere between 3% of GDP up to 20% of GDP. That is the sort of subsidy that we are talking about. And this is, you can say, well, there's other things we subsidize to the tune of 3% of GDP. The military, education, there's things that we subsidize to the tune of 10% of GDP, and that's healthcare. But that is not the sort of subsidies that we're talking about. We're not talking about giving money to the local nurse to keep your grandmother healthy. That is a subsidy that the electorate can get behind. No, we're talking about giving 10% of our income, 30% of our tax revenue to large multinationals who grow monoplantations in faraway countries. That is what we are talking about. And I simply can't see how the electorate would ever sustain that sort of subsidies to large multinationals. I simply cannot see the politics behind this. And therefore I say, well, forget about 2 degrees. It's never going to happen.
No, that's a realistic answer, as one were to say. I'll come back to the role of science and policy, but one last question for Laurie before we sort of go on an ending note and take questions from the audience. So climate change, we talked about this determinism problem, and climate change is often viewed as a stressor that can lead to conflicts and sort of internal threats and crisis. And your work, particularly on climate change and slavery, asks some of these important questions based on, you know, who are at the receiving end. So how would you sort of see this? Who would you see as being at the receiving end, and where are we headed given that the current targets are unrealistic?
Well, yes. I mean, this is another good question because it actually speaks to some of the key issues that Richard was mentioning there, especially related to the kind of global realpolitik that underpins our ability to actually make choices in the current environment. One of the things that I've been interested to look at recently is the way in which these decisions about investment and climate finance get made in the relationship between domestic and global politics, the way in which it's possible to potentially, you know, achieve political change in certain areas. Now, one of the reasons that climate migration is such a big topic is because climate migration is one of those examples of a political topic that reaches across the political divide. So it's something that you can get very liberal people, very left-wing people on board with helping in relation to climate migration. You can also get very right-wing people involved because you don't want billions potentially of people being migrants and potentially crossing international borders, which is the way it tends to get framed. So that's a powerful concept because it creates attention and interest in climate change across the political divide. Another area that creates attention and interest across the political divide is this area of climate change and conflict, which is something that has been increasingly a point of interest in the political discourse around climate change since probably at least the early 90s, when Thomas Homan Dixon famously started to write in this area. And it's something that's kind of bubbled along, in particular, every time there's a major international conflict, people point out quite correctly that there are a variety of climatic factors which are fed into that, potentially drought, for example, or rainfall often, which affect people's ability to have food security. So that is certainly an issue. But then if we look, for example, at the landscape and the global geography of climate finance and climate investment, one of the things that always strikes me is the way in which this has become so reflective of a securitized viewpoint on the impacts of climate change. So there's an overwhelming direction of climate finance increasingly, certainly from the UK government, and even in the days of DFID until recently, when so much of this would be directed towards certain areas of sub-Saharan Africa and in particular in the Middle East, because it was seen as, as almost a double win. This is a particularly powerful tool because it appeals politically to various areas of the political spectrum. So not only we're not just helping, is the idea, we're spending this money on preventing conflicts and preventing migrations, preventing terrorism, and ultimately, helping to secure our borders. So these kind of framings around the way in which climate change creates vulnerability are very important because they are very political. Now, I tend to, certainly as a geographer, shy away from the environmental determinism aspect of it, which is the dominant framing, the idea that, more climate change in areas creates conflict. I tend to focus to a greater extent on the structural determinants which shape that conflict or certainly underpin it in a broader sense. But one area in which I certainly think that it is valid and important to be looking at is the way in which the impacts of climate change shape injustice, or maybe injustice is not the correct framing here, but certainly shape the impacts of climate change in a way that is potentially politically violent, as we see with, for example, slavery, modern slavery. So one of the things that we have noticed, and you mentioned a previous project that I've been doing in recent years, which was called Blood Bricks, was looking at how climate change shapes entry into bonded labour in the Cambodian brick industry. So this was somewhere where we saw that there is a burgeoning industry of brick production in Cambodia in which the majority of people are debt bonded, in which there's very high levels of long-term debt bondage up to 50 years, where people can't leave, they can't work anywhere else. There's very high levels of child labour, very high levels of extremely unhealthy work, which often results even in sudden death. And the question was, why are people coming into this? Why are people agreeing to enter this industry? Because they were literally agreeing, they're bonding themselves in many cases. And climate change undoubtedly played a very significant role as a pressure, as a stressor, and as one of a variety of impacts. But the way in which climate change was shaping rural agricultural patterns, essentially incentivizing people to very rapidly transition away from a traditional smallholder, low capital form of agriculture, in which you use the same seeds year after year and use very little capital to continue to farm in that way, to a system of high capital investment, debt-funded investment, based on changes in rainfall, which made it no longer predictable to farm in the traditional way. That this was a major role in driving people into industries like this. And I think that relationship between climate change-linked precarity at the nexus of economic and climatic factors and highly precarious, highly exploitative, violent, if you wish, labour is a key thing that I think we need to certainly explore to a greater extent in coming years.
No, thank you. I think that was very informative for me and the audience as well. But what I have been hearing from both of you really is that it's not just a matter of science, hard science like physics or chemistry, and trying to figure out this problem. I think there is also a lot of social science and an understanding about how sort of these political and socioeconomic conditions would play out and how the effects pan out. So here's a broad question as we go into sort of Q&A from the audience for you both. So how would you view climate science and policy? Is it particularly the role of the IPCC? Do we want to bring in more social scientists in how we would sort of factor our decisions in reaching the new right target or sort of the impacts of climate change? So yeah, while we hear your answers on that, maybe Aryan, if you could sort of help us collect a few questions from the audience, that'll be great. Also, whoever wants to go.
Oh yeah, well, I'm happy to kick us off. It certainly is. Well, I mean, one of my favourite quotes in the realm of social science and climate change is from the late great John Urry, as one of the major leading lights in the development of mobilities, what we call the mobilities paradigm, which is the idea of looking at migration as something which is far more culturally and socially inflected than was previously given credit for. And as he said, apart from economics, social sciences have been nowhere when it comes to climate change, not even Johnny come lately. And this was written in 2010, I think. So just a decade ago, he was saying quite correctly that the social sciences outside of economics had been almost inexplicably divorced from this hugely important issue, which, remember, this had already been one of the major issues in public discourse in 2010. Up to that point, there was a dip, of course, after Copenhagen, but really mystifying. And I think a large part of that is due to perhaps a certain reluctance to step into a realm that was to a certain extent seen as belonging to a greater extent to climatologists in particular, and to a far more natural scientific discourse. And I think that it has been something which has been very positive, that social scientists have increasingly become willing to involve themselves in these kind of areas, because there's an awful lot to offer. In particular, for example, expertise in field work and understanding problems on their own terms in a way that can potentially bring renovation and innovation in understanding how these problems play out in practice. I think that's something that social scientists certainly bring. And also the critical approach to framings, I think, is very important. It's essentially one of the things that social scientists like geographers, sociologists, anthropologists are constantly doing, is taking received framings and stress testing them in every possible direction, scaling them up, moving them across places, looking at them cross-sectionally, and potentially always attempting to, undermine these frames and understand the way in which we frame climatic problems. So I see that as a positive development, something which can only help more broadly to move the broader discourse and scientific thinking forward.
I want to make 3 points on this.
Please.
First, if you look at climate projections of future climate change, then actually scenario uncertainty is more important than uncertainty about climate processes. So the social sciences are more important in future climate change than the natural sciences. If you look at the impacts of climate change and assumptions about how people will respond to this, adaptation to climate change can, in many cases, flip the sign. So again, the social sciences are more important than the natural sciences in determining the impacts of climate change. Now, the third point, you also spoke about the IPCC and what its role is. It's important to understand the IPCC as an organization, as a governmental organization. So the IPCC will never say to politicians, you are wrong, guys. That is simply not its remit. It will never do that. So in order to change the political discourse, you need to look outside the IPCC, not inside the IPCC.
Great. No, great. I love the point you made about IAMs and stressing on that. I was kind of expecting you would come on with that. That was amazing. Great. Aryan, do we have questions from the audience?
Hello, can you hear us?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. So thank you, Richard, Laurie, and Sanshian for this lovely panel. We have a question from Sabine.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk today. It was really interesting to listen to. Just a quick question based on the title of the talk. I've been really interested in the recent demographic trends taking place. We're seeing growing populations in developing countries, stagnation in developed countries, with some exceptions. For example, in the UK, there's a recent bump in the amount of 18-year-olds. We also see that there are, in general, just massive demographic shifts, and this will change the way we tackle most environmental policies. I wanted to hear your thoughts on what demographic trends do you think are the most worrying, which ones do you think are the most significant, and how you think they'll play into policy later on.
Shall we go with Richard first, or Laurie? Okay, go for it.
No, I've spoken twice in a row, so I think Richard's.
I don't know the answer to this question. As I knew, there's two things I'd like to say, and Laurie sort of hinted at this, but did not really spell it out. A lot of the discussion about environmental migration and climate migrants and climate refugees has very significant racist overtones. It is, we don't want those Black people to come to our European shores, is essentially the message. That's why we should be worried about climate change. I disagree with that completely. I think, as we've seen, we'll stop them in the Mediterranean or we'll stop them in the Channel, right? We'll let them drown before they reach us. The second point about demography is a point that is often overlooked, and that is that significant parts of the world are aging, and particularly China is aging rapidly. Now, we have seen a period of very low interest rates, which at least to some extent is due to very large savings rates in China and an oversupply of capital. Now, this is important for climate policy because renewables don't have fuel costs, but have a lot of capital costs. So if the interest rate goes up, as it must as China retires, the costs of wind and solar will go up instead of down, and that will change the landscape of climate policy more than people realize. I realize that this is a completely or very incomplete answer to your question, but it's the best I can do. Maybe Laurie can do that.
Laurie, up to you.
Well, I think I have to be similarly broad. I mean, the simple answer is I think probably the most important demographic trend is the failure of global northern populations to rapidly decline, but since they are such huge actors in the realm of emissions. I think that's a key thing. One of the most frustrating areas that I find in the connection between demography and climate change is the continued reliance amongst even quite often quite educated and engaged people in the ongoing trope between populations and emissions, populations and the climate crisis. The rapidly growing populations in, for example, sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia are not the problem in a broad sense. This is something that's been created externally to those populations, and it's quite likely that those populations themselves will be the people that have to solve it. So yes, I think demography in terms of rapid population growth is certainly not the problem. It's about distribution of emissions, distributions of impacts. That's the way in which we should potentially reframe the question.
Thank you so much. I'm conscious of the time. So on that, I would like to thank our speakers once again, and thank you for the lovely audience for attending and asking those questions. I wish you all a great rest of the symposium, and stay safe, guys. Take care. It was lovely to sort of chair this panel. Thanks.
Thank you, Richard and Laurie. We have. Thank you very much for this lovely panel once again.